stays in Colombia, in Bologna, and has been a collaborator of the GENMO Nature of the University of Extremadura between 2015 and 2018, and between 2022 and 2025. Chair and module, well, we have been working together because we have co-organized summer courses in the Yuste Foundation. She's also a substitute judge at the Provincial Court of Badajoz, and she has a lot in common with the speaker, because they're working on the protection of fundamental rights, equality, constitutional protection, the control of constitutionality, and gender equality in rural areas, as well as democratic memory with a gender perspective. So Lorena comes from, well, she's been working in-house, so to say. She's from this family because she's been working with us in many projects. So you have the floor.
Bueno, buenos días a todos.
Good morning. It is an honor and a pleasure for me to be here with the Yuste family, even if this is Guadalupe. And I'm very happy to be here in this chapter room, whether we are observing the rules or not, or challenging them. I'd like to think that we are going to challenge the rules because this is the aim of this kind of seminars. This is something that the university system, so much focused on the quantitative production, is preventing us from doing. I mean, it's preventing us from doing this qualitative work with suggestions and remarks that want to qualitatively contribute to improve these kind of debates. I'd like to thank the Yuste Foundation, and particularly for having me here to introduce you Paola Andrea Forero Ospina, because I have been happy to see how interesting her background is. She's going to be a good stimulus to this debate. Paola Andrea Forero Ospina is a psychologist and holds a degree in Colombian University, and then holds a master's degree in the St. Thomas University in Colombia, and is now a PhD candidate at the University of Caldas, again in Colombia. And she has a very interesting background because she has covered many aspects, so that the research is very versatile. It's theoretical and but practical. She's been a consultant with extensive experience in peace building, public leadership, human rights, gender-based violence, youth and civic participation, and she's has organized projects with public entities and private companies. She's now leading a research project in a consultancy firm. She has also been working for public entities, and lately she has worked on her research, for instance, on human rights, peace building, gender-based violence, youth and civic participation. And also gender and intersectionality approaches, social design, participatory methodologies. This is both theoretically and practically very solid. She has a very solid background with very good marks, and she's going to be a stimulus because, as I said, she's going to be talking about intersectionality, multisensory experiences as a horizon for co-creation, co-designing pathways to transform gender-based violence among diverse women. So this is again a mix of democratic memory, gender perspective, psychology, law, So this is a very, very intersectional topic with a series of aspects that will be the basis for a very fruitful debate. Thank you, Paola. You have the floor.
Bueno, muy buen día a todos y a todas. Gracias, Lorena, por esa generosidad en tu presentación.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Lorena, for this kind introduction. Thank you, Yuste Foundation, for this opportunity you've given me to bring this experience from my country, Colombia. I would also like to thank the Minister for Science and Ecology in Colombia because they've awarded me a grant for high skills in the region, in my country, in the Caldas University in Manizales, in my country. So I now passed my PhD candidacy test. So now I am in the fieldwork stage, and I'm sure that you have already finished it. Some of you. My director is Silvia Caña Canaveral, a virtual and visual artist with extensive background in peace building, gender perspective, development of materialities. And also she holds a PhD in design and creation, and now she is a professor of the Valle University in Colombia. So my presentation today is about multisensory experiences as a horizon for co-creation, co-designing pathway to transform gender-based violence among diverse women. And this is helping us to start this journey from my perspective as a researcher. And well, I want to show you this video first of all.
Sí, no sé qué pasa. ¿No tiene sonido? Sí, se activa en el PowerPoint. Allí está el parlante.
¿Quién es la investigadora? Soy una mujer cisgénero de clase media, nacida en el centro del país, en una tierra tejida por mujeres que me habitaron incluso antes de que llegara al mundo.
This valley was inhabited by the interpreter apologizes, but the music is too loud for us to interpret the words.
Sin tener a quien pedirle permiso. Mi abuela materna resistió la violencia y levantó su familia.
I come from a violence-struck family. You can see my mother, my grandmother. The women in my family have always tried to teach me important values such as independence and especially economic independence. I left my hometown 16 years ago because of the pervasive violence.
Las resistieron lo insoportable. Desde regiones atravesadas por la guerra, sus voces me narraron historias rotas pero llenas de dignidad. Cada testimonio era también un espejo, fragmentado pero reflejo al fin. Acompañarlas no ha sido solo una labor académica, ha sido una forma de observar la historia de los dolores de las mujeres que me habitan, de significar el pasado y comprender que en cada testimonio de violencia también hay una chispa de dignidad encendida. En este sentipensar llego a los territorios heridos, donde el mar, el río y la montaña me abrazaron. Descubrí que mi historia estaba escrita en las historias de otras. Mis abuelas, mis tías, mis amigas, las niñas que fuimos, las disidentes sexuales, las campesinas, las sobrevivientes de la guerra. Me encontré siendo muchas en una, la que acompaña, la que escucha, la que pregunta, la que sana junto con otras. Comprendí que investigar desde un enfoque feminista situado es ante todo un gesto de encuentro entre historias, memorias y mujeres. Esta historia me permitió entender mi lugar. ¿Por qué acompaño procesos de mujeres víctimas? ¿Por qué mi voz se entrelaza con las suyas? Porque también yo he vivido violencias. Porque mi vida, como la de tantas, ha sido una travesía entre fracturas y reconstrucciones. Allí, donde se entrecruzan voces, memorias y cuerpos, habitamos un territorio común donde el ser mujer desborda arquetipos. Allí surge la potencia de un ser mujeres en plural, donde la dignidad es horizonte y el cuidado una práctica viva para cohabitar los territorios. Ay, perdón. No sé cómo devolverlo. Bueno,
Okay. So this is along the lines of my research proposal, because I have to say that this feeling and thinking concept comes from Falsborda, a Colombian philosopher. And he says that volume, both feeling and thinking, makes sense, and this is the approach I want to use. Because my research is about emotionality and placing the sensitivity of the researcher within the research project. So this research is about something very recent, because this notion was only recognized by the academic world around 10 years ago, at least in Colombia. This is a new way for us to generate this knowledge. So this is like the background information of my research. And now I want to start my traditional presentation. I mean, my presentation of my research the traditional way. This senti pensar term in Spanish that could be translated as feeling and thinking together, and we have like 3 stages in this project: senti pensar 1, senti pensar 2, and senti pensar 3. And then I can show you the methodology with the progress I've made in my fieldwork. So the first element I want to mention when setting up this problem is that my country, Colombia, has been in conflicts for more than 60 years. And there has been confrontation between illegal and legal sides, actors, with consequences on the civil society in a very impactful way. Women being the main affected population. 9,900,000 victims, according to the records, and around 50% of them are women. So these numbers have to be understood, because those are the victims that have been officially recorded as victims. So they have been recognized, but I'm sure this number is significantly higher. And you need to know this because after the peace agreements, after 2016, when the national government sat down with the FARC guerrilla in Havana, in Cuba, for the peace-building process, it became visible that the civil society, the civil population, and the social population had a role in that peace-building process, and that's where we found the women associations They started getting involved in the peace-building processes because they understood that the psychosocial rehabilitation, the comprehensive repair process means that all victims' voices need to be heard, all the victims and survivors. After 2016, there were many entities that would become guarantors of the peace-building agreements. I'm talking about, for instance, the special peace jurisdiction. Again, the women associations became key leaders and key stakeholders because they are articulating the specific needs of women in the context of this war. There is, for instance, the macro case number 11 that shows the differential consequences that conflict had on women. Another important element for my research is about the visibilization of stereotypes and constructs in the social arena that have been supporting institutional violence against women in conflicts, in armed conflicts and wars. The female body has been used as a loot to generate social constructs that are very deep. So we have witnessed types of violence that have been standardized within the war arena and within their homes. This is an institutionalized violence. When we talk about this violence in the context of the gender-based violence, has important consequences in terms of different or specific consequences or differential consequences. That's why I wanted to understand the gender-based violence from an intersectional perspective. In my country, we can see different layers: ethnicity, disability, the background or the geographic origin, and they intersect. When we talk about this violence in Manizales, in Caldas, well, you need to see where it is. This is the city of Manizales. Manizales lies in the northwestern central area of Colombia, right next to the Andes mountain range. In Manizales, there were not many cases of direct violence, but we have been hosting or receiving many victims and survivors. And so Manizales has seen this conflict as the idea of something that doesn't exist. Violence does not exist, and many authors say that this is a ghost reality. And well, even if this conflict did not take place in Manizales, we still have seen many victims and survivors coming to us. So in terms of numbers, we need to emphasize that there is a series of expressions and structural matrix of this violent phenomenon reflected in domestic violence, intrafamily violence, violence against teenagers, children, boys and girls, and women.
Adicionalmente al fenómeno de la violencia.
Additional to the phenomenon of violence as a ghost situation, there are other social phenomena that have contributed to this breeding ground of violence, including urban violence connected to microtraffic, youth gangs, fights over the territory by illegal groups. And here is where displaced women are disproportionately affected in terms of sexual exploitation, economic exploitation, and this is a cause of a phenomenon in which violence is inscribed in an ecosystem of normalization and silencing. And this is important because, in a way, in this structural matrix, the silencing, the social legitimation of violence is major aspect that happens in the public and private sphere. The phenomenon of violence in figures. For 2024, we are talking about a situation in which 2.19% of the total population that is suffering gender-based violence. We find that Manizales is ranks on the 10th position in terms of gender violence. The University of Caldas is in Manizales. And I approached this university because of the phenomena that had been happening before my research work. In 2024, the Ministry of Science and Technology launched a call for a research in the field of the peace building context, and research started. It was a type of research called collective togetherness in Caldas. So there was a mapping of different social organizations of women that were connected to the peace building process. So I approached one of the main researchers that is connected to the International Education and Human Development Center. So I approached an organization called the Network of Women Writers in Caldas. And I started later on my research with them. I will very briefly develop some of the main categories in my research because I think this makes it possible to clarify the horizon, the scope of my research. First, we have this category, being diverse women. This is Donna Haraway's perspective. Women's identities are diverse, multiple, broad. And this is aligned with an intersectional approach. We have different conditions like ethnic conditions, sexual orientation. This was widely developed by Kimberly Crenshaw. And this approach allows us to understand this dimension, intersectionality. Co-creation is another category in my research because in the design and creation practices are a very important element, particularly when we talk about peace construction, peace building. And this is a horizontal knowledge construction process, and the community ties are recognized based on an idea where it's not the experts but the lived experiences that determine the process. Particularly, I developed a connection with different research that different universities have carried out in Caldas in the field of peace laboratories. Diana Suarez Albano is a doctor who developed a wide approach in the design. Another author that I want to mention is Arturo Escobar. He's a Colombian who lives in the United States, and he mentions a very important concept, which is the ontology of the design. Ontology of design involves that there's an agency that goes beyond the materiality of things. And this is very much connected to symbolic, imaginary, and the connections of objects. The next element in my proposal has to do with multisensory narrative. This multisensoriality involves understanding the relations with the world, with the reality, and this involves an approach that goes much beyond cognitive aspects. The understanding of reality is about the importance between the connection between body, meaning the body is a scenario of meaning, and this dynamic interaction between subject, object, author can help us to understand the activation of the five senses that shared experience, in the words of Katia Mandioki, a Mexican researcher, that allows me to link this sensitive experience with emotional, affectional aspects. The narrative that I propose is a horizon of creation. This is aesthetic and cultural mediation that will allow me to connect technical, material, political, and symbolic aspects framed in a very specific context, the context of Colombia, and more specifically that of Manizales. One last aspect that I want to emphasize is the concept of body cognition. Mental processes are not just what happens in the head, but the interaction between brain and body. It is a concept that I borrowed from a researcher whose name is Varela. Lastly, two additional categories: feeling, thinking. I already introduced this. It's a way of knowledge that connects reason and emotion to understand and transform the reality based on lived experience. In social psychology, this experience of subjectivity is rooted in a social experience that is symbolic and that's privileged the knowledge of some constructs that allow us to understand this reality. And it's a concept that has to do with more abstract categories, for example, the social identity broadly developed by Takfer. So these would be my research categories, and I would like to show this map. I know there are many concepts, many elements to understand where I stand, but this map makes it possible to understand where my research is rooted in a specific context, like the context of Colombia. This allows us to understand the role of social women's organizations that are generating new ways of understanding this reality. They are supporting women who are understanding that their bodies have suffered violence, and those aspects, those violences that we understand as natural and we may not even perceive, those violences have an effect and leave a trace. And institutional attention is necessary. Integral care support is necessary for recovery. This is very important in my research, and that's why I carried out an extensive review that took me a long time on the background, the research background. I covered more theoretical research and other a category of more aesthetic backgrounds, because I wanted to have this approach that is more aesthetic, more connected to artistic practices, because art has served to reproduce stereotypes that sustain violence against women. But on the other hand, art can also be used for raising visibility on violence. And in Colombia, there are several artists that have carried out this denounce through their work. In this background research, I researched gender violence and these violence against women, trying to find for and feminicides too. So I looked for examples on how gender-based violence has a large dimension in Latin America. In parallel, I want to share this work that, in my view, is very revealing, very telling in terms of a proposal from a researcher whose name is Deborah Arango. She's a painter from Colombia. In 1944, she presented a work that was called Justicia, Justice. She is presenting what could be a case of gender-based violence against the body of a woman through a police action. It is very interesting because Deborah Arango has been recognized as a painter who talked or addressed the role of women in the society of Colombia. Another topic, another theme, has to do with art, feminisms, aesthetic, political practices that has been developed in several universities. I have different examples of theses from Spanish universities. So this connection between art, feminisms, and political action has been analyzed because women's organizations have used other languages, other forms of denouncing and addressing violence through narratives that are not necessarily conventional narratives, but narratives that use other forms like video art, performances, media, art. And there's a group called Feminas Festivas, festive females. These women create content that denounce violence against women. These themes have to do with co-creation, participatory actions, and aesthetic creations. And we can see different researchers here. Here we have some doctorate theses and some research have addressed co-creation and these sort of practices. I want to mention the experience of a women's organization that is in Montes de Maria. It's a region that was heavily affected by the armed conflict. And there we have the Mampujan weavers. These women use the quilt technique to work on the memories of their experience through weaving. So in Buenos Aires, their work was presented. It was a design congress, and this knowledge was recognized. This organization received the Nobel Peace Award in 2015.
Referentes artísticos, pues que no.
There are many artistic references. I can't explain all of them, but I just want you to know that there are many aesthetic practices that address gender-based violence, and there are more theoretical references with approaches that are interesting in my opinion. Participatory social design, ontological social design, the notion of body expression and phenomenology. So references like Maurice Merleau-Ponty are important and should be mentioned. Gender-based violence and the notion of intersectionality. And lastly, I think we are witnessing the need for memory in the field of peace construction. So the idea of memory, the representation of the conflict, and the fact that there are actions that have an impact that leave traces, and citizens should not forget. This should be a horizon that should not be repeated, as many entities have mentioned. For example, the Center for the Historic Memory. We need a guarantee of non-repetition. This is very important, and that's why all these exercises are so important. So my research question is, how can we develop a multisensory narrative about being women in a co-creation process with diverse women in Manizales integrating practices and representations that are aesthetic and promote empowerment, self-expression, and resilience in the face of gender-based violence? Secondary questions: what are the representations on being women that young women of ethnic identities have, territorial, sexual, and gender diverse women in Manizales in connection to organizations of peace-building women and their reflections on gender-based violence? The next one: what methodologies can be implemented to mobilize aesthetics, senses, and languages that contribute to empowerment? And the last secondary question: what aspects in the co-creation processes are fundamental to design a mediation methodology that strengthens the self-expression and resilience? With this last one, I will advance my end purpose that has to do with the development of a methodology. Once the research process finishes, I will have a methodology for gender-based violence, and it will address the importance of including local leaders, and this methodology is expected to be hosted in an open access platform so that it can be replicated in other seminars, and these reflections can be extrapolated in other cases of conflict, war, etc.
La investigación-creación, entonces, es el punto central en el cual
Investigation plus creation. I will develop a multisensory narrative understood as a system of meaning and sense to carry out this transformation of gender-based violence. I'm going to advance to tell you about the launching of the research. I'm very excited about this because this is something that I am living and that I am experiencing. And this allows me to share with you this proposal of the co-creation horizon, that is the narrative. We started to work with a group of women in Manizales, and we started to do this as an open call to women leaders who wish to work with a researcher like me in a university, who wish to attend to a creation space. We have a media lab, a creation space. So we also wanted to connect other organizations. For me, it is important to mention this because in the context where I work, research, maybe here research is carried out in conditions that may seem ideal from the Latin America perspective. I do have a grant, but my grant only takes me so far. There are limited resources. But this is not something that I can devote myself 100%. The doctorate is part of my life project as a member of the academia and researcher, but I'm also a consultant and I work in the field of social projects. So that's how I came to the need to create a connection between my projects and the network of writers of Caldas, the media lab in the university, and an entity that is called Design for All. Can we watch the video, please?
Y quiero mostrarles esto que aparece en...
I want to show you this that you can see on the screen. This is a book, object book, that includes the experience of people with visual impairment through erotic stories. This book is called Con las yemas de la piel, with the fingertips, and it explores different sensory resources. It's very tactile, and the purpose is to raise awareness of what the erotic experience of people with visual impairment means. Through this open call, we wanted to make it possible that women who arrived were very sensitive. So, and we received candidates or participants that had different types of disability, like a visual impairment. They are writers who write stories, poetry. So the call involved co-designing a multisensory log. So that first moment of the call allowed me to identify that group of women who was going to be involved in the research creation process. So we started developing the first part of my project, identifying the representations on being women. The methods used up until that moment around the proposal have to do with encounters on the subjectivity that goes through the body. My approach has to do with senses and the audiovisual, and we therefore develop a scenario in which this sensory log would be built. Secondly, we organized an intersubjectivity meeting to generate this dialogue between meeting as a point of encounter of their subjectivities, to try to find those elements that the experience of violence gives us. If there's a meeting of women, there will probably be some elements that we share that have to do with that experience of the social role that we have, that we're inserted in, but also it has to do with the experience on the territory, the direct experience with violence. In this second intersubjectivity meeting, we exchanged life experiences. We used resources like an element that are like tattoos on the skin to rebuild the body memory on the scars that violence leaves. And I located some change dimensions in each of the methods. I have the first specific objective. The change dimension expected has to do with the strengthening of the self-expression capacity, because talk about violence is not simple. I allow myself to address this topic because of my training as a psychologist, but in many cases we are dealing with a memory that is too sensitive and that requires a very ethical and careful approach. The next element in the expected change dimension for the meeting number 2, intersubjectivity meeting, has to do with the development of a safe space where we can identify stereotypes. For example, we can talk about a box of broken stereotypes where the idea is to identify those meanings that since girls we have received. Since we were girls, we hear that things are the way they are. So we have been building our own identity as women based on those elements. So it is important to know what those stereotypes are. I will show you who the women are. This was the first meeting. It's very recent. It took place on September 13th. We started building this trust, understanding what image, word, and meaning is. There are various concepts that I am developing, and the idea of their participation is that they are to become creators. We are carrying out research creation. I am not the expert, although I'm carrying out a doctorate research. It is collective horizontal learning that is going on here. So the idea is to build trust through methodologies like word or word circles and different ways of different techniques that have to be very careful and very transparent. A resource that is used in different researches and that I have been able to track is embroidery. Embroidery as a practice. I don't know if this is very common in Spain. In the old days, women would meet to embroider and talk about intimate things, to know what happened in other people's lives. So I used this resource. It has been used in different researches that have to do with violence and peace building to create a safe space. To tell them there are many materials. I arrived to this media lab space. I put many material on display, fabric, thread, paint, and the idea is to let them understand that this model allows for uncertainty.
Paso a paso para desarrollar la investigación, pero la investigación
Research creation allows itself to be more open. So this exercise of embroidery made it possible to understand what it means to co-design, to build an image collectively. Some motivations were identified for participating in the project. I don't have time to explain this, but I want to talk to you about the second meeting. The second meeting was about the subjectivities that affect the body. That's where we started building this log, this art book, aimed at developing all the languages that go beyond what's visual and that have to do with a way of representing this beauty, this violence, and identify elements for transformation in the in line with different narratives. And lastly, their intersubjectivity encounter. This was very recent when you have resources like paint, thread, and different materials to people who are not familiar with this. This may cause reluctancy. You feel you are forced to make pretty things and you may not be good at drawing. So thanks to the support of my thesis director, who's a renowned artist, we have been exploring expression forms for women to feel comfortable and to find the creators within them. These exercises are aimed at pursuing this idea. Lastly, I would like to wrap up with these elements that are very important in my opinion and that could be a contribution. When we talk about being a woman, being women with disability, and being victims of violence, we have three elements that are very important to understand. Women's bodies, with all their diversities, deserve attention, deserve support. And although this is a reality that has much to do with Colombia, I know it can be extrapolated to other contexts. Thank you very much.
Sí. Bueno, muchísimas gracias por la...
Thank you very much for your presentation. I really liked it. I think it brings us closer to a research that is just starting, but in my view, it has very solid and robust pillars. I want to share some thoughts about your work, and I will probably suggest a few things, and then I'll close with a question. I will try to be brief, but I took many notes because it's a very rich project, because it brings together different disciplines. It connects not so many legal aspects, but I will tell you what the legal implications are. We can also talk about public policies, culture, and psychology, and also international humanitarian law, gender studies, and human rights. I think it's a very ambitious work, very rich work, and that has the potential of responding to multidisciplinarity, which is something that we are required to do, this cross-cutting aspect.
So the first thing that strikes me is that you have given us a whole context before delving into the problem question, before defining the purpose of your work. So my suggestion is to start with the objective once you start writing the thesis, because you only told us what you intended when you were 40 minutes into it. So once you start writing, you need to understand, readers need to know the purpose of the research as soon as possible. That is a very ambitious question that perfectly explains why you are giving us so much context. And then regarding the question again, you're not answering it in your presentation today because the research is still very preliminary or very new to the stage. But I still think the methodology is very mature, very consolidated, with very good bibliographic references, with very solid references in terms of feminism, the gender perspective, the intersectionality approach, based on all the progress made in the gender studies in the 80s, the 90s, the criticism of the and then all the experts Wembley Hathaway. I think it's a very solid framework. You have all the international references in terms of feminism and intersectionality theories, but I'm probably missing, because of my background, some current contemporary legal feminism references, because I think they would endorse the construction of a methodology that aspires to becoming a public policy or funded by a public policy. Precisely. And I think this is because of my professional background. I'm going beyond, a different dimension from the one you have set up, because you have a very sensory and psychological construction the creation of a safe space, a co-creation space. This is very interesting if this methodology becomes a reality, but this must become a public policy with public funding, not just funded by an NGO for 2 or 3 years, then left in a public server or in a private server that cannot be kept because it is too expensive and they cannot pay for it. So we need a guarantee of non-repetition because this is directly linked to the peace building and memory retrieval processes. So we need to reveal the truth, we need to clarify the truth, we need to listen to the victims and the survivors in the process of co-creation, and so that we can turn it into testimony. And then we can use it as a guarantee not to repeat it in other territories, in the same territory and as a model in other territories, because the aim is to demonstrate something that can be then replicated with small variations if needed in similar territories. And for me, Colombia is a territory that can be a reference, can be a model after 60 years of conflict, can become a model for other peace-building processes, because at least they decide to create a truth commission created by women who are the subject and the object of the violence, because even if they are perpetrators of violence, they are subject to other violence. And there are many female experts that have published it. But going back to the idea of the public policies, I think we need some endorsement, legal and institutional endorsement, so that this work can be sustained over time. And for that, you need to link it to the guarantees of non-repetition and the right to access culture in the dimension of the democratic participation. This is something fashionable in recent years in the studies of human rights and fundamental rights. Culture as an expression of the political pluralism and democratic participation, the democratic society we want to be. So that way you have a very solid starting point with a good methodology that you can develop with your work. You can have that endorsement with that for you to be able to sell it to the institutions and for it to be incorporated into a public policy. I think that is the most interesting aspect of your work. So my question was, have you ever thought of that? So that you can have a longer research instead of just publishing it in a website for 2 years and having it at just one specific case. Yes, so that's one of my purposes. When I started out with this idea or this proposal, since I also executed some public policies, I thought of it as one of the possible avenues. But you know that in a research project, you know that people sometimes tell you that is too ambitious. You shouldn't use that as your purpose. Don't get too carried away. But I think maybe after this research is done, can generate some territorial dialogues. Especially in my region, in Manizales, it can be executed, it can be used by the municipal women's office. Maybe they can use it for some programs. In Colombia, the design of public policies, the designing is only after a long process. So if I were to do so, I should knock on many doors. But at least in my research, I'd like to at least focus on the methodological development, and then at a later stage I could focus on maybe the sustainability and the impact on the long run. Thank you. Time for questions and comments. So, Teresa, yeah? Okay, thank you for this detailed and suggestive explanation. So, I'm along the lines of Professor CHANO. I'm a jurist too, because I see the potential coming from the practical application of your research and all it implies. For it to be influential, you need some legal basis. You don't need to delve into a whole legal research, but you need some legal basis, some legal foundation, because otherwise those who would be able to put it into practice would reject it, because they would say, who's forcing me to do so? There's no legal background. And then the second reason is that the female recipients of your work could use it as a legal proposal for their activities to be accepted and validated. The humanitarian international law is best for this work, especially those covering armed conflicts, because they safeguard the victims and the survivors' rights. And armed conflicts produce many psychological and physical disabilities. So you have a corpus of measures, legal measures, that you can add to your research, that you can use to help those victims and survivors. In Latin America, you also have the Belém do Pará Convention that covers the whole area, and there is some case law in the American court covering women in armed conflicts, women that have some major disabilities because of the war. And you also need to know one of the UN agencies, the Human Rights Ombudsman. Human Rights Ombudsman. So, well, you have many agencies, and then you have the rapporteur, the United Nations rapporteurs for the defense of women's human rights. So you can find some examples in there. You will find a whole list of measures that you can add to your research. So you can add it maybe within a small box or a small section in your research, and that will help you in your efforts to transform this into a public policy. We're talking about public policies, we're talking about human rights, rights of these people, rights of women with disabilities. Thank you. That was very kind. Thank you, Paola, for this presentation. I also come from Colombia, but I lived in Germany for many years. I wasn't aware of the whole dimension of the problem. This is also a very painful topic for me. So now at this geopolitical moment in time we are living, with the surge in the number of conflicts worldwide, are you aware of similar initiatives in similar countries, such as Ukraine, the Gaza Strip, No, I haven't tracked them down. I haven't studied them. I only came to this exercise after a study that I took part into for a ministry in Colombia. We talked about differential consequences in the macro case number 11, the special peace jurisdiction for women. But I think we should move forward using some compared perspective, but this is not what I'm focusing on now. I've had a hard time trying to find a specific topic or to put boundaries to this topic. So that was very difficult for me because I had to leave behind some of the ambitions I had at the beginning. But well, at least that is a door I can open. When I'm saying that this methodology needs to be extrapolable and replicable, I'm thinking about Ukraine, Syria. I've collaborated with the Kroc Institute that is accompanying peace building processes in different territories, for instance in Ireland. So I think this is a door that I will probably knock on in the future.
Gracias, Paola, por la exposición.
Thank you, Paola, for the presentation and the work. I like the approach. I'd like to know the methodology and application. I'd like to know about the application and methodology of the sentir pensar, the feeling and thinking. And I like to see that you are using the book of erotic tales. This concept, this notion comes from placing the experience of the creator. That's why I showed my bio in a video. I talked about my experience and my background because I wanted to explain how I came to work with women, this subjective feeling and thinking, the expectation of the idea of the researcher that is like smearing us. You have to leave it aside, you have to leave it out of the research because it's kind of dirty. It's like a blemish in your research. But now we're breaking away with the idea of this subjectivity. So this is one of the principles of my research. I wanted to add some subjectivity. In the books written by Fals Borda, that historian from the Caribbean coast in Colombia, you have like two parts. On the one side of the page, you have a personal diary. On the other side of the page, you have the tales of the people living in the Colombian marshes. So this is both research and creation, and that is one of the main principles in my research: the emotional link, the emotional ties, the affective ties with your topic of research. That is subjective, and at the same time we're being honest in this type of social research. And well, this is what I wanted to show because I've been doing much traditional research, I've been writing papers, I've been doing research for the testing of hypotheses. But well, in my walk of life, I've been approaching other types of methodologies that are consistent with the way I see the world and the way I can see my contribution as a researcher. Hi, Paola. Thank you very much for your presentation. It is a very interesting topic. It is the first time for me. It's the first time I see this research creation process. We all we both come from the same background, psychology, so I'd like to know what your experience was like when you were co-creating with those women, those victims or survivors of the conflict with disabilities. What did you learn from those experiences? Because that is a very delicate and sensitive topic. So I'd like to know what questions you took into account, what questions you considered, if it was easy or if they were reluctant. Thank you, Brigitte. Well, we should discuss this over coffee. Well, what I can tell you for the time being is that I always carry with me a lab guide. When we work in communities, you follow the guide and then you see the harsh reality. So you have to be flexible. What I can tell you of those gender-based experiences in the group of women I have talked to, well, they are writers, they are creators, so they have some sensitivity and a certain openness to certain questions, certain spaces. But at the same time, there was some reluctance. It was difficult for them to see me as a researcher. That was an element for and against accepting me. When we started out with our discussions over the body, the multi-sensory effects, etc., you suddenly start delving into the violence they have sustained, the pain, the scars, the marks. And you can see it in the paintings. For instance, they used art therapy practices, somatic practices, as different ways to approach or to tackle those triggers. The expression of these forms of art is like a trigger. It mobilizes that expressivity, that history, that violent past they have sustained and experienced in their bodies. Any more questions? Yes, he needs a microphone.
Hola Paola, bueno, como...
Hi Paola, I knew you were going to be brilliant. I liked your methodology very much. Research and creation. I don't know whether it's like research action, the research action methodology. The person doing the research does something, adds some action. Well, my question is you were talking about a book by a researcher, and on one page there was like a personal diary, and on the other side of the page there was the information about the research. Yes, it was a book by a historian in the Caribbean coast. And well, my question is whether you would consider doing something like that yourself. Because I think you could, because of your personal experiences and everything you have, all the experiences you have collected, your personal experience after doing this research, and also because you are a historian and you are a woman. Well, as a good social researcher, I have my fieldwork diary, and I want to never get rid of my reflections, my reflective nature. So I always have to write down my research reports. And when I write them down, I also use some audiovisual language. So that narrative for me should incorporate my voice. I want to strike a balance because I don't want it to be my autobiography. I want to really make justice. But the question is, yes, I am considering doing something along the lines of false border. But yes, I will probably do something like that, and maybe in the final research report. Thank you. Paola. I have a remark along the lines of Lorena CHANO's intervention, and beyond the remarks of the placing of the question and the legal aspects or the legal basis. This is something about the logistics. The first time you say the word disability was 55 minutes into your presentation. So since disability is one of the cornerstones of your work, we expect you to mention this term, disability, earlier in the written paper. You still have 4 months to work upon it and to hand in the final draft, the final paper. And well, you still have to do some field work, and you have to add how this is affecting people with disabilities. What are the effects of this artistic co-creation in the people with disabilities? Because in your presentation, you only said out of 10 million people, 50% are have been victims or survivors of the armed conflict. 10 million people were victims or survivors of the armed conflict, but only 50% of them were women. But that doesn't give us any perspective whatsoever on how these type of interventions, these art interventions, are helping them. The idea of this seminar is to have at the end a list of results or outcomes that could be used on people with disabilities. We're talking conflicts, armed conflicts, so disability is there precisely as one of the results of the conflict. But when it comes to women and gender-based violence, in this context, disability has to be more relevant. That is my only remark for the final paper, because all the contextualization was fantastic. Very good presentation, very good speech, very good arguments, very good train of thought. But well, this is the question. The only slide was slide number 55. Yes, I need to make it more explicit. So since I am working with a grant, I needed to talk about the multisensory aspects with universal design, because we don't want to segregate with this research. So multisensory aspects are a resource to connect the experience of people with disabilities that at the same time have survived an armed conflict. Well, I'm gonna side with you. Well, this is a debate. This is a discussion. There is some echo. Well, maybe. I don't know that the sound is not perfect, but anyway. I want to move forward, and I endorse the words by Miguel. If you reinforce the practical and the theoretical framework of the intersectionality, that would be great for the disability. Because yes, of course, if we're talking about conflicts, there is war, wounds, there is death, there are victims, because we're talking physical disability here. But what about the a very fashionable term, mental health, in Spain and elsewhere. It's almost a disability, a mental disability with all the traumas caused by on conflict or acts of terror. So with all this, you don't need to really work on this conceptually or in a practical way to really channel this work through to the main topic, which is disability. You can canalize it to the main topic, and then you can add intersectionality. You have the mother of intersectionality, Chenso, and some others, some more people who have worked on the connection between disability and gender. So you don't need to really do something else. You don't really need to add any more things. So I'm trying to defend you, but not so much. At least I'm siding with you more so than the.
Yeah, I have a comment and maybe one question. I also work with victims. I specialize in transitional justice, so in the post-conflict settings, and I also work with victims of terrorism. So I perfectly understand your point, you know, that the age, gender, disability playing an important role in, you know, how the violence manifests itself, the extent of violence, but also, you know, its consequences over time, so which are very, very sometimes hard to grasp. But I am wondering, this was also part of someone else's question, whether there is something your research can benefit from in, you know, by including this comparative perspective of, you know, other post-conflict settings. Maybe, well, I specialize in the post-Yugoslav region. So as you know, from the 1990s, it was one of the first transitional justice laboratories. And if I was thinking throughout the whole presentation, you know, like specific cases where the victims were, well, gender aside, whether the victims were persons with disabilities. So this is a quite important question. I think there is a lot that you can contribute to this across different kind of mechanisms, you know, from criminal justice through reparations to visibility, memorialization, symbolic politics, etc., etc. Because the more, let's say, accumulated are these specific vulnerabilities, women, you know, gender, age, people with specific disabilities, etc., the more they are invisible in the whole process. So, I mean, there is a lot you can contribute on this topic. So maybe just a question about this comparative perspective. Did it inform your research? Okay, and how do you see incorporating your specific results into, you know, the broader knowledge base on this? And maybe one very, very specific question, because I see that you are very passionate about what you do, and thank you also yesterday for that really bracelet that you shared with us. How is it for you to work on this specific topic? I mean, it is not very easy to work with people who have suffered different kinds of traumas and such experiences that leave such deep scars. Thank you.
Thank you. Bueno, muchas.
Thank you. There was many remarks, many questions. I think the comparative perspective is something I will probably tackle in my postdoctoral stage, because I have to close this thesis and I have to do it right. But if something comes up that can be replicated, I of course will work on it. So this context is, I see context everywhere. I see migrants. I traveled through Switzerland and Italy, and I saw the problem of migration in Europe, and I think there is something to be done about it. And probably this violence, these consequences for people who had to flee their territories will be seen. It's like Manizales, that is hosting many, that is receiving many migrants. Well, the same is Europe, but it's only at a larger scale. Europe is hosting many migrants, so that is one of the questions, well, that is one of the issues that can benefit from this type of research on the medium long term. Once I have some outputs, I can use them as input for that compared perspective you're proposing. And as for my personal experience, what about me when I work on these topics? Well, since I graduated, I've worked in peace building. This is also my personal contribution. As a researcher, as a social stakeholder, I want to contribute to the peace building process in my country. I take care of myself, of course. I do self-care practices. I'm very much aware of the realities of our territories. Colombia is a place that is very beautiful, the most beautiful country for me. And I also think that the Colombian population is very resilient. We are ready to be resilient. We are resistant. And there is also this learning, this lesson we learn as human beings, and we take care of life. And this is what moves me. This is the driver behind my work. I take care of others, children, women. That is my personal tie. And I'm very passionate about it because this is part of my personal life.
Muchas gracias. No sé si...
Thank you. Frédéric? No? That was Lorena. And that would be the final remark. We still have some time, but, well, you need to do the closing remarks. Yeah, we need to channel this back to the topic of disability. I think your work has a very solid theoretical framework when it comes to creating all the intersectionalities of the co-creation process. As Professor Martin said, disability is an intersection. So for the final paper, you need to specify the intersectionality in terms of disabilities and in the co-creation processes that you can do with people with disabilities, because the methodology has not been developed. You just have a starting question, a hypothesis, and a plan. But if in the end you create focus groups, you have to document those, and you need to make sure that at least the sample is, in the sample you have women with disabilities. So you have like different aspects you need to explore, and for the final paper you need to explore vastly. You need to vastly explore the aspect of disability. You need to exploit the quantitative and qualitative data, but make sure that you can do it at a general level and more specifically with women with disability. This is like only a small section of your work. I would say that if you're working on 5 different chapters in your thesis, you need to focus on the aspect of disability for this paper, for this grant. And I just want to emphasize something else. This is more than one chapter. This is more than one section. Disability is the central, is the cornerstone of your research. Of course, you can do something, you can add something specific about gender, the gender perspective, especially in this framework of co-creation and co-construction or co-building, the reconstruction of your country after the many decades of conflict. You can give us the context, but the cornerstone should be disabilities with some variants and some variables, gender, the conflict, and maybe that's it. Even the consequences of the evolution of the conflict or the conflicts on the affected population. That is a methodology that you will have to develop in your dissertation or for this paper. You need a comprehensive and complex methodology.
Gracias.
Sí, yo aquí simplemente.
And to wrap up, if there are no further interventions, I would like to say, and this is not something just for you, but to all recipients, sometimes our grants may give rise to confusion, like we are supporting a specific thesis. It's not the case.
El criterio de que vosotros estéis haciendo un doctorado es
your work may be on journalism, law, or any type of discipline. But what we want is to know that whether or not your thesis has something to do with the theme or not, the work that you introduce has to be connected to it. Because someone was asking me during a coffee break, hey, it would be interesting that the outcome of our work should reach decision makers. Well, the European Forum on Disability represents over 100 million people. There are over 800 organizations represented, so we can do this lobbying work to reach public institutions and decision makers. We can take the work that you introduced as a basis. So it is important that the concept and the topic is well present so that they can see the use in connection with your work. Of course, always in the context of your specialization and in the thesis work that you are developing. This is a constructive comment because you have a few months ahead to develop your work that you are going to introduce. So this is with regards to the connection between the work that you do and the topic that we are proposing. If there are no further questions, let's give a round of applause to Paola.